Hello and welcome to this live stream on the new global trade war. I'm Ruth Pollard, Bloomberg Opinion's managing editor here in Asia, and joining me is our markets columnist Shuli in Hong Kong, and in Singapore, our politics columnist Karishma Vaswani. Well, it has been difficult to keep up with the blistering pace of developments from US President Donald Trump's first weeks in office. Both American allies and competitors have been in the firing line, and those who haven't are waiting nervously on the sidelines to see when their time will come. Mexico and China both earned a month's reprieve from tariffs. Mexico and Canada both earned a month's reprieve from tariffs, while China refused to offer up any concessions to avoid the levies Trump ordered. Instead, it hit back with a range of measures against the US, including tariffs of its own. So let's try and unpack some of these developments in what has been a very fast-moving story. Shuli, let's start with you. You wrote today that China is going into this renewed trade war with a weaker hand. Can you tell us what happened? How did we get here?
So in a global trade war, the economy that has the strong, powerful consumer base wins, and unfortunately, that insight has seems to go missing in Beijing. What happened was that after 2018, China doubled down on its industrial policy, basically trying to achieve technological independence and self-reliance. On the other hand, it kind of ignored its middle class welfare, and what we are seeing is in 2018, private consumption accounted for 2/3 of the GDP growth. Now it counts for less than 1/3. Instead, next exports is contributing to roughly half of China's growth. That actually means that compared to 2018, China is more vulnerable to Trump's trade wars and the threats.
So, I mean, would you say that that Xi has really missed an opportunity here to help China's consumer class grow and prosper as a very good buffer to what it needs to do to defend itself in this trade war?
Absolutely. Too much attention has been on the industrial side. I mean, China has made a lot of progress, right? Like we have BYD taking the world by storm. Huawei is doing very well as well. But on the other hand, Chinese consumers, they exited the COVID lockdowns more than 1 year after the rest of the world. And then when they exited in late 2022, what they discovered was that basically the economy suffers from long COVID. And what we are seeing even today is that, so-called rotten tails, basically unfinished apartment buildings left by distressed developers, they're peppered across China. So even though you're not directly affected. When people travel, take road trips, they see that consumer rights are not being protected, right? And then also China's tech crackdown during COVID era, it has left the big tech companies unwilling to hire. And then all the fresh young college graduates, what do you expect them to do? So a lot of them are sitting at home, becoming so-called professional children, basically, just staying at home and taking care of parents or whatever. And the middle-class parents, basically 50-year-olds, they're very anxious. And as a result, the Chinese consumers, they're basically hunkering down. It's not that Chinese consumers don't have money. A lot of them do. They're just not willing to spend.
Thanks, Shuli, that's right. And Karishma, if I could come to you now, from an international relations perspective, you've argued that all this hubris and chaos will ultimately have consequences for the US. How so?
Well, Ruth, in the course of the last couple of days, we've seen Donald Trump come out and place those tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China, as you talked about, reverse the ones on Canada and Mexico, give them a reprieve with Beijing. That appears to be continuing for the moment, although there is a discussion that is expected to take place between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump at some point. So, the picture from out here in Singapore, and certainly amongst many of the sort of diplomats I've been speaking to and business people, it is one of unpredictable chaos. And what that does is send a message, and I'm sure this is the message that Donald Trump wants to have back at home with his domestic audience. And, let's be clear, that is the most important audience for Donald Trump. He is playing to the gallery back in the United States. And what that message has been over the last few days is, I've shown the world who's boss. And, the narrative has been that Canada and Mexico did what I wanted them to do. So it's a short-term win, certainly for the Trump administration. But in the long term, what this does, I think, Ruth, is it damages the reputation of the United States as a sort of fair player on the international stage. We can't forget that the economic growth that we've seen over the last 50, 60 years or so, that was created largely in part, obviously China's growth was a huge factor, as Shuli was talking about, in Asia, but the architecture of that growth came from the international rules-based order, and the United States was a big part, and in fact, the main part of that. And I think a lot of Asian countries looked at the Trump administration in the first term and thought, yeah, you know what, we can deal with him in Trump 2.0 as well. But now they're looking at this sort of erratic behavior, and they're wondering, what should our playbook be for Trump 2.0? And I think that is damaging for the United States.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, just to follow on from that, you've written before that China is poised to take advantage of this chaos and to move into areas where the US seems like it's retreating from. So how will that work? What can China do to take advantage of all of this?
Well, China has consistently said that it is, a sort of fair player on the global stage. It's a responsible actor. It's talked, Xi Jinping has talked in forums like Davos, at the World Economic Forum, at an APEC summit a couple of years ago, I think in the first Trump administration, actually, during that time where the speech by Xi Jinping was about how China was ready to be a part of the global family, and then followed on by Donald Trump, who was talking about America first. So this is something we've heard from China for some time. And, with the caveats that Shuli has pointed out already in terms of how it is on the back foot when it comes to the economy, what it has been able to do is pursue very strong economic relationships with countries in Asia. It is the main trading partner for most of the nations out in this region. And what that has been able to buy it is political influence with a lot of countries, particularly at a time when you do have what appears to be a leadership vacuum. Over the last week or so, we've heard from countries like Malaysia who are thinking, maybe we're next in the firing line, because it's impossible to say, right? Like, what might end up causing, you to be in the line of fire. And, we've already heard from Donald Trump talking about the BRICS group of nations, where he has said on his Truth Social platform that that's something, if they were to come about and create a sort of competitive currency to the US dollar, he would be looking to put tariffs on them as well. So countries like Malaysia are saying, okay, we're ready to be prepared for anything at this point. And if that means increasing trade with countries like China, well, then we're going to do it. And this plays right into the narrative that Beijing has consistently positioned itself as the natural leader for countries in the global south. And if the United States actually wants to continue to have influence in Asia and wield that kind of power in this part of the world, then it should be trying to cement its relationships with its partners and allies in the region, as opposed to be weakening them.
Of course. And Shuli, I wonder if you would weigh in here. Do you see China positioning itself to take the opportunity of the chaos of these first weeks of the Trump administration and make inroads with countries that it already has some alliances with?
I think, of course, China would like to, but it's a very high road that is walking, right? Like the one thing that I'm sure, like across Southeast Asia, all the nations are worried is the Chinese yuan. Basically, they're very worried that China was going to use the yuan as basically tool to counter Trump's 10%, 20% down the road, right? And we have seen that in the past. Whenever China, the People's Bank of China, the central bank, lowers its yuan fix, you will see the Korean dong, like the Malaysian ringgit, they will fall. And it's not really good for the governments, right? Like people don't like it when their currencies weaken. People have to, get agricultural exports, and it's going to increase the cost of living for a lot of middle class. So they are definitely very nervous when they look at China and what Beijing might do.
Right. And Shuli, staying with you for the moment. So China has announced its own measures against the US. Its antitrust watchdog is examining Apple's policies. It's launched an investigation into Google. and it's tightened export controls over critical minerals, and it's added 2 US companies to its blacklist of unreliable entities. But you've written that there are other things that China could do to counter Trump's tariffs. Do you want to talk us through them?
Well, they're all going to be very difficult choices, and the President Xi Jinping has to make a lot of sacrifice. The number one thing is fiscal stimulus. Beijing has been really, we have known that they have been talking about big stimulus since late September, and not much has come about, in part because China has a lot of debt already. The debt to GDP ratio is 300%, one of the highest in the world. But with the stimulus, economists generally agree that, China needs to have a package of at least 5% of GDP per year going forward for the next 4 years, just to stabilize the economy. And we're talking about another 20% of debt to GDP ratio. And it will be not palatable for President Xi Jinping, right? And another thing is, unfortunately, a currency war. I mean, the yuan has been artificially high for the last 2 months, right? And what China is going to do, I mean, a lot of Chinese, they are eager to move their wealth overseas. And the capital control the wall of capital control has been erected. Still, it can be porous, right? So is she willing to deal with a possible capital outflow? Another thing is perhaps to let TikTok go. I mean, Trump talked about America, the US government buying a stake. And we all know TikTok is very valuable. I mean, even when Elon Musk bought Twitter, it was worth $40 billion. But the US buyers, they're talking about $20 billion for TikTok, which is really, really lowball. And President Xi has to swallow up his pride and say, okay, it's your decision. Something that's worth $100 billion, perhaps more, will be sold at 20% discount, and so be it.
Of course. And Karishma, I wanted to ask you about what your observations are of how Asian countries are evaluating Trump's actions, specifically with Canada and Mexico, and I guess a little bit with Panama as well, because of course we saw Panama offer some concessions this week too. Are Asian countries preparing their own concessions to placate Trump as he rolls out his tariff regime?
Yeah, I think they would be wise to do that. And I'm sure many of them are sort of sitting down and thinking about what can they possibly offer in return for, in exchange for not getting either slapped with tariffs or as a way to get tariffs off you, right? And already there are countries that may well be in the firing line because they have a huge trade surplus, or they have trade surpluses with the United States. And that appears to be one way that Trump is determining, which countries he might look at. Although I do think it is also worth pointing out that, in this particular instance, the tariffs were placed for political reasons, right? Like he's looking at immigrants, he's looking at drugs. In the Panama Canal instance, he's looking at CCP influence. So it's quite clear that he is willing to use economic tools for political motivations and or political gain, rather. And I think a lot of Asian countries will be looking at the strategy that they end up, sort of being inflicted with from him. And that's something they will have to bear in mind. But I think it's complicated as well, because they understand that he is somebody who really depends on personal relationships to do business with as well. And I think that's why you're seeing the likes of Narendra Modi and the Japanese Prime Minister heading to Washington, in the coming days and next week. And I think they're going to try and build on those personal relationships to get a look in to see what Donald Trump is thinking. And, if you think about how the Biden administration was a corraler of support in Southeast Asia, but also with Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, and sort of built this network of countries that could stand as a bulwark to China. You're seeing a sort of splintering of that right now, or certainly not countries coming together in the way that they have before. And I think for Washington's foreign policy objectives, if indeed, Trump has talked about this, Rubio has talked about this, Beijing is a strategic competitor. They've talked about the Chinese Communist Party as one of the greatest threats that the United States faces. Then it doesn't feel like they're actually implementing policies that will achieve the targets of trying to keep China in check. I mean, it's early days, right? We're only in week 3. And I do think TikTok is a bargaining factor in all of this. I think Taiwan is very much on the table for Xi Jinping. It is one of the key issues for the Chinese Communist Party. And Donald Trump is well aware of that, right? Like, I can certainly see a situation where Taiwan would be on the negotiating table between President Xi and Donald Trump. Which way that negotiation goes, I think it's very hard to say at the moment. But Ruth and I, you and I were in Taipei not too long ago, and certainly there was a great degree of apprehension about what a Trump presidency might bring.
Absolutely, and I think that apprehension is felt across the globe. Shuli, I wanted to ask you. You've written this week that Xi Jinping won't cave easily, and as you've said, he's known in China as Mr. Big. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Right. So if you go around China, like, people wouldn't call Xi Jinping by name. They will call him Dada. Some people say it means uncle, but I don't really agree because I've never heard that term before. It really means big. So it's Mr. Big, the one on top, in part because he is the most powerful politician in decades. And one thing that the President Xi has talked about is the China dream, right? Like, basically that the world that will not just have the US being the dominant force. Instead, we'll have a more equal, multipolar world. And if Trump demands something and he just caves in immediately, that really undermines that narrative, right? Mr. Big cannot act like Justin Trudeau. In Chinese, he has a nickname called Little Potato. So I think unfortunately that he's just not going to cave in that easily.
Yeah, I just to jump in there. I totally agree. I think it's really difficult for Xi Jinping at this point in time in terms of his political legitimacy, both internationally, but again, just like Donald Trump, he really cares, right, Shuli, about what happens at home. And, you have a situation where there's been a purge in the cabinet of defense ministers and the like. The ongoings of the Chinese Communist Party are always opaque. It's like a black box in there, but it's even more so now. And he sort of staked his claim on being the guy who is going to achieve, the national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, right? And for all intents and purposes, Donald Trump was done with by Trump, administration 1.0. And now they're back at it again. And actually, I was looking at how the Chinese sort of matched tariffs in the first set of tariffs during the 2018, in the first set of the trade war, I should say. And back then it was like every time Trump put in some tariffs, the Chinese would match, right? And they kept doing that. They sort of, in dating parlance, matched each other's energy, right? But this time around, I was really surprised, and I wonder what you think as well, Shuli and Ruth, by the fact that the tariff, the response from China was not as robust as I thought it could have been. It was sort of saying, hey, we could do a lot more here, but we're leaving the table, open for talks, because we want to show you that degree of symbolism that we could come down hard. We do mean business, but at the same time, we want a deal here. And that's the sense I got. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think in 2025, China is entering a second trade war, unexpected second trade war. No one had expected Trump will win again, right? Then 2018, and in large part because of the weaker consumer base. 2018, Chinese consumers were flexing their muscles. I mean, it is 1.4 billion people, and as of 2018, China was already the world's largest luxury market. And then now US is actually the world's largest luxury market. So the consumers are now spending, which means that he just has less bargaining power than before. And it really goes down to, there are two arguments, right? In a trade war, you can do two things. You can try to be independent, just be a closed little economy. You produce whatever you need, and that's it. Or you have a very powerful consumer society, like what US has right now. That's why Trump can throw insults at foreign heads of state and can demand this and that, because everyone wants to sell to America. And And unfortunately, from 2018 to 2025, she has accomplished nothing, right? Like independence, what are we talking about? Net exports account for roughly half of China's growth. And the consumer base, not so powerful. Consumers are saving and doing self-care. They're not spending that much.
Mm.
And all the while, I mean, for the last 3 days now, we've been waiting for that Trump-Xi phone call to happen, and it hasn't happened. Trump spoke to Trudeau, he spoke to the Mexican president, and yet the meeting of these two world leaders just isn't happening. What's behind the delay, do you think, Karishma?
I think Trump has a real sense of timing. I think, far be it from me to sort of psychoanalyze him, but the fact that he is saying that, there's no rush, I can take my time, and I'm not going to run and jump and sort of call President Xi Jinping. He knows, full well that this is all part of the negotiating dance between the two sides. And I think it also allows China to sit down and think about what the next moves are. We've seen drips and drabs coming out from Beijing in terms of their policy decisions when it comes to tackling the trade war. And I think we'll see more of those before any other discussion or a discussion takes place. In the past as well, during the Biden administration, a lot of work went into trying to build some kind of backdoor channels between the sort of people who are working on drafting agreements, whether it was on climate or even fentanyl, people in the National Security Council. And that kind of work has not yet been done under the Trump administration. That kind of outreach hasn't necessarily taken place. I think that would be a very wise thing to do, to show a degree of goodwill and a gesture that there are serious, issues at play here. It's not just about the trade war. These are the two most powerful countries in the world, not just economically, but also in terms of so many areas where they could collaborate and cooperate. And one of the things that certainly struck me looking at the fentanyl discussion, this week, Donald Trump is not wrong to want to clamp down on the fentanyl trade. It's a huge issue domestically in the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and it's a devastatingly addictive drug. And, as I wrote in a column earlier this week, it was one of the issues that American voters wanted their leader to address ahead of reducing the budget deficit and unemployment. So it's really right up there. He is doing what his voters want him to do. But I do wonder, if you've got a gun pointed to your head in terms of this trade negotiation, is that the best way to go about getting cooperation? On a really serious issue? And the Chinese have already said, well, fentanyl, it's your problem, America, and let's try and fix this in a rational fashion, but tariffs are not the way. And again, I don't think Beijing's wrong in saying that.
Yeah, and it seems that everything that Trump has done this week has really left Beijing not wanting to have a phone call. Why would you want to discuss something with someone who appears to you to be making irrational decisions and just hitting out at countries for seemingly no reason? So I'm not surprised that the phone call hasn't taken place. Shuli, what do you think?
I think I'm with you, girls, on that. Girls. I do think that she wants a proper diplomatic back channel, and Trump doesn't do proper. And as Mr. Big of China, he's just not going to cater to Trump's whimsical tweets, unfortunately.
So Shuli, I wanted to ask you about Chinese consumers, because they've featured a lot in our discussion this evening. How are they feeling about this, new outbreak of a trade war between the US and China? What do we know about the sentiment on the ground there?
Cannot be good, right? Let's talk about US trying to restrict sales, Tmall and the Shein sales. Textile, household goods, etc. That the Tmall and Sell are the third largest category of Chinese imports into the U.S. after computer equipment and electronics. And unfortunately, a lot of the factories they are basically privately owned enterprises, right? That are peppered across the Shanghai region and the southern Guangdong region, and that they employ a lot of people. And I don't see that the consumers feel good about it. There's already the property downturn. Big tech is now hiring. And now, and by the way, China's economic rise is strongly tied to exports, right? If people, even if your family business has nothing to do with exports, if they feel like, oh, we cannot export anymore, that means that strikes a hard blow to people's psychology. They just feel like, oh, the source of our original income is gone. How can we survive? So I just don't see that the Chinese feel good about this.
And I mean, is that sentiment sort of mirrored across Asia, do you think, Karishma, that there will be concerns in the other, China plus one nations as well, of Vietnam, maybe India as well, and Malaysia, that their consumer sentiment will be badly affected too?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, right? Like, we're coming off an environment where the Ukraine war has given rise to inflation, particularly food prices across Asia as well. That's been a big pressure point for middle-class families. There was this sense that, okay, maybe we can heave a sigh of relief and we can move into a sort of stronger global economic growth period. It doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. I think there are real concerns about other issues away from the trade war that governments are distracted by and not paying attention to. The rise of AI, for instance, with lots of countries worried about how that might affect job losses. If they are replacing workers with AI functions, then that's going to be a real issue for government regulation as well. But more broadly, I think it's really difficult, and it's actually imperative for governments to start thinking beyond the next 4 years, right? Right now, everybody's wrapped up in the sort of breathless analysis and day-to-day ongoings of the Trump administration. But there are 4 years left of this. And we've got to find a way out in terms of what's going to happen, at the end of the Trump administration, what the global economy looks like, and what other countries in Asia are going to do about that too.
And I guess it's pretty difficult to measure a lot of Trump's first term in office because COVID happened in the middle of it, right? And threw global supply chains and the world economy into complete disarray. So I wonder, how difficult is it for us to sort of predict what this is going to look like in 4 years' time, particularly, as you say, with AI thrown into the mix? Shuli, would you like to comment on that?
I think of what China needs to do, and I agree with Karishma, right? Like, you need to look beyond the next 4 years. And what China needs to do is to look inward and to say, how do we build a resilient economy? And that goes back to building up its consumer confidence. I mean, China's consumption to GDP ratio is only 40%. It's very low compared to even, in Japan, people are also very thrifty, right? In Japan, the consumption to GDP ratio is 55%. If we look at the other emerging markets in Brazil, it will be like 65%. So what China needs to do is to boost consumer confidence and empower the 1.4 billion people. And perhaps that could actually achieve the so-called China dream. Just paying attention to industrial policies, throwing money, cheap financing loans to a few industrial companies. Sure, there are national champions, but they're just not going to provide that much employment, right? A lot of the work is actually, unfortunately, going to be automated. AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, they don't need that many people. Instead, I think China needs to build up a service-based economy.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that is the dream of so many of the nations in Asia. I mean, India would be an obvious example of that too. Karishma, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've written a lot about the importance of the networks that the previous US administration under Joe Biden had built to sort of strengthen the resolve of Asian nations against what they see as China's expansionist policies. So how important is it going to be in the next 4 years to kind of maintain the health of these alliances and make sure that they don't just fade into the distance as the trade war takes up all of the space and oxygen?
Yeah, no, it's such an important question, Ruth. And, a lot of people that I talk to who support what Trump is doing, they often say to me, we voted for Trump to make America great again, not to make other countries great again. And that's absolutely legitimate. That, that it's their country, it's their political system. But my response to that is, well, if the Trump administration wants to keep America safe, then it does need to pay attention to what's going on out here. And in particular, it needs to pay attention to the network of alliances with countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Southeast Asia, India as well, Australia as well. Now, all of these places have been very good partners to the United States, particularly under the Biden administration, because they did work together. Even though they had China as some of their biggest, often main trading partner, they worked together to sort of say, okay, in places like the South China Sea, where many of these countries have stakes, they want freedom of navigation, they want to ensure rule of law. That was a bulwark against Beijing's increasing expansionism. And that is important for US foreign policy. And I think the Trump administration, as much as it wants to focus on domestic policy, needs to keep that in mind, because it will have a direct impact on American security and prosperity.
Okay, well, look, I feel like that is a good spot for us to wrap up. Thank you to everyone who's listened in to this Bloomberg Opinion discussion on the new trade war. Thank you very much to our speakers, Shuli Ren in Hong Kong and Karishma Vaswani in Singapore. I'm Ruth Pollard, coming to you from Tokyo. Thank you very much.